Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on X, and folks, we're also on TikTok. So please do send in your comments. Please send in your greetings. Please tell us where you are watching from and tell us what's on your mind on this auspicious anniversary of the 10th year after the UK membership referendum on Thursday, the 18th of September 2014. 10 years ago today, folks, was that famous day in British and world history. The referendum that decided whether or not the United Kingdom would continue to exist or whether it would end, whether the hundreds of years of shared history, shared political history would come to an end, or whether it would continue for better, or no doubt, some might say, for worse. So that's 10 years ago on this night. And in this program, we're going to revisit that. We're going to talk about it. And coming up at the bottom of the hour at 7:30 will be our guest, David Scott, who will be discussing this with us. Where do we stand 10 years on? Where does Scotland stand? Where does the United Kingdom stand? Has it indeed been for better, or has it been for worse? Or could it have been better? Or could it have been much worse? That's what we're going to be talking about. And I'm sure you've got your ideas as well. I know people on TikTok will have some of their ideas as well. So please do tell us what you think 10 years on from that famous day in history, the Scottish UK membership referendum. Some people call it the Scottish independence referendum, but that's one way of describing it. Certainly, that's the way that most of us described it at the time. But when you think about it, that was a deliberate framing that Alex Salmond put together. He got to really choose everything because we had a leader, if you remember at the time, it was David Cameron. And he tended not really to know very much about Scotland or indeed much of what constitutes the United Kingdom. And he did give an awful lot away to Alex Salmond, and he allowed Alex Salmond basically to choose the date and to choose almost the question, really, at the end of the day, certainly to choose the franchise, i.e. who got to vote. And basically everything else that was worth choosing, he gave to Alex Salmond, and still Alex Salmond lost, despite having massive publicity and really a lot of support at the time. Let's say hello to some folk who have come in. Debbie says, "Good evening, everyone. Happy Union Day." Derek Hart says, "Hello to unionists around the world. What a great, hot, sunny day." Absolutely. It was something in the low 70s today. Alan says, 10 years since we saved the country and really brought out the bitterness in some of the losers. Well, yes, we did a graphic, which we'll put up later today. 10 years ago, we voted no. Let's have a quick look at that one if we can. It's a classic that we do. Elizabeth is talking here. Oh, hang on. There you go. 10 years ago, I voted no and helped save the United Kingdom. And of course, 2 years later, that was followed by 2 years later, that was followed by another referendum, as Elizabeth Johnston points out, where very little happened after the 2016 vote. And the EU, 2016 vote being, of course, the EU separation referendum. And she suggests Starmer wants to sneak us back in. Mags reminds everybody to hit the like button on YouTube and on Facebook and on Twitter. And folks, if you're on Twitter, please do give us a repost and give us a quote post. And let's get this video going out. Get this video going out there. John says that the people of Scotland voted not to break up the UK because we knew it would end in disaster. And continues, it's time the SNP were investigated for their fraudulent misuse of Scotland's public funding on SNP private projects. Absolutely, their deluded indie fixation. So true. Tam says it was the best vote they ever made. Hello to Robert and to Anthony. Good stuff, Anthony. Always good to see you around. So let's look at the voting figures that came out the next day on the 19th. Let's look at the results, and I'll just run you through them because we tend to think that it was a 55% win for those of us who wanted to keep the UK together and a 45% loss. But you can break it further down and we can see that it was almost an 11% win for those of us who want to keep the UK together. Where are we now? There we go. And the question, of course, should Scotland be an independent country? Now, if you look at that question, there's nothing about the United Kingdom there. Nothing about the UK at all. It's not, should Scotland leave the UK? Should the UK be broken up? Should Scotland leave the UK and become independent from the UK? You know, things like that. Things like that would have given you some kind of idea that there was actually another factor here. It wasn't just all about Scotland. It was about also the United Kingdom, the integrity of the United Kingdom, the maintenance of the United Kingdom. But even in the question itself, the idea, the reality of the UK as a nation was utterly absent. And do not tell me that did not cost us 2 or 3 percentage points. It absolutely would, especially when you compare it to the EU ballot paper, which was all about should Britain leave the EU and become separate outside of the EU. The EU was mentioned several times throughout the entire ballot paper, but in the ballot paper for the UK membership referendum, it was just simply that: should Scotland be an independent country, yes or no? And even though N comes before Y in the alphabet, yes was the first option. Again, ridiculous. But there you go. It was the highest ever electoral turnout, I think, in British history, with only 15.41% not voting. So our side took 55.25% of the turnout, which is equivalent to just about 47% of the overall electorate. And the yes side, the yes to breaking up the UK, took 44.65% of turnout, which is about 38% of the electorate. So 383,937,000 more people voted no than yes. And 62.15% of the electorate either voted no or did not vote. Well, thank goodness. Thank goodness for that. However, in many ways, it was a great victory, a thankful victory, but the it was kind of thrown away. It was thrown away because the very next day, if you remember, David Cameron came out and said that he would now promise a whole new raft of powers to the Scottish Parliament. He had no reason to do that. He had no reason to do that. All he had done, therefore, was set up a new political discourse, a new political story, which would now be about how many powers are we going to give Holyrood. And of course, as we warned at the time, too many powers would never be enough for them. And so Sturgeon, for the next couple of years, was able to run a very effective campaign about how Westminster had lied to everybody and how they weren't to be trusted and all that sort of stuff, which is still believed today, even though the subsequent Scotland Act delivered massive new powers to Holyrood. A kind of like prize for losing. It was all pointless. And all it did was just embolden and strengthen the Scottish nationalists. And if we remember back in 2015, at the general election, which followed just a few months later, such was Sturgeon's ability to turn that around that the SNP got, of the 59 Scottish seats, the SNP got 57 of them. I'm just going to quickly check that figure. 57 of them, and there was only one Tory and there was only one Labour who got elected. However, what did the SNP really at the end of the day do with that? What did they do with that? Did they sorry, the SNP took 56 out of 59 seats in the British Parliament. And it appeared to be a body blow, as it were, for the British, but at the end of the day, for the British Union. But at the end of the day, it wasn't, because as we pointed out at the time, these are 56 SNP MPs going to the British Parliament, taking part in British politics. And indeed, it's an opportunity for them to widen their horizons, to see the bigger picture of the United Kingdom, and indeed contribute their ideas to the good governance of the rest of the United Kingdom. And that's what we wanted. That's what we wrote about. We actually said the SNP majority is a British opportunity. And that's an article that you can find on our Old Legacy site, where we examined that particular massive victory of the SNP at that general election. And we showed how, in fact, it could benefit the Union. At the end of the day, everything was a little bit of a disappointment for the SNP. They didn't really take to helping the rest of the UK very much. They and then in the next election, they lost, of those 56, they lost, I think, 21 of them. At the next election, which would have been the oh gosh, now you're asking, was the one in 2017. There was a period when there was just general elections all the time. You remember that? Anyway, we're now down to the sorry state for the SNP of just a handful of SNP MPs. So I think the last 10 years have been a disappointment for the Scottish National Party, and certainly not something that they can look back on with a great deal of pride. And I think it's because they made a lot of mistakes. Sturgeon, for example, making a big fuss about the Brexit referendum, I think damaged her. When 2016 came along, Scotland had voted to stay, or at least a majority of votes in Scotland were for staying in the EU. She tried to make a big thing of that and tried to start demanding another referendum, which, if she had any sense, she would have seen she wasn't really in a position legally to make happen. And so what she then ended up doing was consistently upsetting her followers, consistently leading them up to the top of the hill and then back down again. And that eventually was to be her undoing. That was to be her undoing. along with other things, of course, along with her ideology. Factions Guru says the SNP failed so hard. Sikola says the SNP is a disaster. Tam says 10 years on and the SNP are still banging the same tune, the same lies. It's just to cause more divide in Scotland. Lone Star says Brexit was her second stab at a referendum. It ultimately ruined her, didn't it? Catherine notes that the SNP have diminished in the last few years considerably. And now Labour is going down too. Well, Labour has, of course, designs on putting Anas Sarwar in as First Minister in May 2026, which is only 20 months away. Whether they're going to be able to do that or not is going to depend really on how Keir Starmer is faring, because I say this to everybody, how the SNP does is usually an inverse reaction to how well the government at Westminster is doing. So if Keir Starmer is not hitting the right buttons, and if he is in fact causing lots of problems, then what's going to happen is the SNP are going to rise again in the polls. And so, because people in Scotland have always got that option, like in England, you don't really have that clever option to vote for. But in Scotland, if you don't like what Labour or Tories are doing, you've always got the SNP. That's what kind of makes Scotland a little bit different. That's what maintains the politics up here, is the SNP is always the other option that you can go to. But perhaps people will have thought that or will realise that the SNP isn't really going to have been the option. And this is something that we'll maybe get into talking about more with David when he's on at the bottom of the hour. But think about it. Say Scotland had won, the Scottish National Party had won its Scottish independence and Scotland was so-called independent. Would things look a lot different from what they are just now? I don't really see how, because you'd have had these people that we've got today in the SNP. They'd be doing the same kind of things that they're doing right now. They'd be failing to address the problems that we have. They'd probably be making them worse because they would be free to make them worse. So take, for example, immigration. They'd be opening up the borders completely, because that's what the SNP want to do. So we might think that Scotland's got an immigration problem at the moment. It stems largely from the politics of Westminster. But we know that the SNP want to make that immigration problem a lot worse. So they would have opened up the borders. Would they really have got control of crime and the drug addiction problem? Well, they would need to be completely changing their tune on that matter to get control of that. Would education have improved? Would probably not. We'd probably be spending all our money on even more ridiculous climate nonsense. The Greens would be in power. Would probably be in coalition in some ways. So, I mean, things wouldn't be perfect. People don't. Some of the Scottish nationalists, maybe on TikTok, they might think, oh, if only we could be independent, we'd be perfect. We'd have a great nation, but we wouldn't really. It wouldn't be any different, because it's the same people that we've got right now who would be running a so-called independent country. How's that going to be better? In what way? More options might become available, but if you've got poor leadership, these options will be grasped only to make things worse. And Scotland might be a small country. There might be, 5.5 million of us, but we can divide ideologically just as many ways against each other as the United Kingdom, a nation of 68 million people, divides up. If there's 100 different ideological tendencies in the UK, there's going to be 200 of them in Scotland. It's not like we're all going to gel together and all the 5.5 million people in Scotland are all going to go around singing Kumbaya together under a tree drinking Coca-Cola. It's not going to happen. We'll be as fractious as we ever were, for better or for worse. So politics always comes down to, well, what's the sort of least worst option here? That's unless if you're not actually totally ideologically inspired by some overarching grand vision, which in some ways we like to think we are here at A Force for Good. David says something interesting. He says the biggest fan of independence is Putin. Well, I suppose Putin would not want to see a cohesive United Kingdom. He would want to see one of the most powerful countries in the world broken up. And we certainly are one of the most powerful countries in the world. On this day in British history, the 18th of September, 1917, there was the first ever royal investiture, which is a fancy way of saying an award ceremony, which had ever been held in Scotland. And it was held at Ibrox Park on this day, the 18th of September. And we've got one or two photographs here from the Daily Record at the time, which we'll just put up. But there we go. His Majesty holds an investiture in Ibrox Park. That was the front of the Daily Record the very next day. Let's get rid of that banner that's running around the bottom there. And that was King George V. And it says there in the middle picture, it says the royal investiture in Ibrox Park yesterday afternoon was the first held in Scotland for more than, that looks like 100 years, and the first public ceremony of this kind in Scotland. Well, that's true, because prior to then, these sorts of ceremonies would be behind closed doors, no doubt. Okay. There on the left, the King putting the Victoria Cross on the breast of Private Harry Christian, Royal Lancaster Regiment. He is at present an invalid of a local hospital. I looked into that guy actually today, Harry Christian VC, and he had saved several of his colleagues from who were injured, but who were lying at the bottom of a bomb crater, while he himself was coming under fire. And he was subsequently badly wounded and returned home and received his Victoria Cross there in Glasgow. Thankfully, he survived the war and died in 1974 after being the landlord at a pub in Cumberland. And on the right here is somebody I'm going to give some more publicity to in our issue of Union Heart, which is a lady who accepted, essentially, I think it's called basically the OBE. The King presented the first ever OBE to that lady, Lizzie Robinson, who was a munitions worker in Cardonald, Glasgow. And he presented it to her also in the sense of an award to that workforce of women at the Cardonald Munitions Factory. Especially, she was chosen because she had not missed a shift in 18 months, 7 days a week from 6 a.m. until 5:30, and on night shifts every 2 weeks. The first woman to be awarded the Medal of the Order of the British Empire, which had been created round about that time. Okay. And some other people being presented there with their awards. Excellent. Okay. Now, folks, please welcome a good friend of the show, David Scott. Hello there, David.
Hello, Alistair. Thank you very much for having me back on. It's a real pleasure to join you again.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. We were thinking about who has got a good opinion on 10 years of Scottish history after the referendum, and there can't be any other man except yourself, I think, on that, because you've got a lot to say, not only on that, but also on the SNP as such, and on their reign of success or chaos, depending which side of the fence some of our viewers may stand on that particular matter. But yeah, how would you like to begin such a summing up, as it were?
I think we should give the opening line to Hamza Yusuf. So Hamza tweeted out today, "Still gutted 10 years on, but also proud of my country. While the referendum campaign had some unpleasant moments, it was overwhelmingly an incredible demonstration of participative democracy, where not a drop of blood was spilled, something we should not take for granted." That sounds a bit like a threat, but we'll come back to that. Right? I responded to, and I want to comment on what he's saying there just in a minute, but I responded to him. But actually, before I give you my response, the point he's making is correct. I went to the pre-poll rally that Alex Salmond and the SNP held in Arbroath on the eve of the poll in 2014. Now, I went there to ask some questions, but they'd already clocked me from previous roadshows, so there was no way I was getting picked to ask a question. But afterwards, we all went. It was in a church, and we all went to Church Hall and had tea with Alex Salmond and all the SNP cabinet. There was no security there. And I came away and thought, that's actually quite remarkable, because there was no need for any security. Those people knew they were safe in our country. Those people knew we could have that debate and everyone would be okay. And there was no even suggestion of violence or anything like that. And that's what Hamza's talking about. And it's true, but it was, I think, one-sided, because that's not the atmosphere that they've spent the last 10 years creating. Now, my answer to him was, yes, you knew you were safe in amongst the unionist majority, and that had you had won the election, they would have honoured the vote. After 10 years of you dishonouring our decision, there is no chance that the unionist majority will ever trust you again. This is the problem of being led by donkeys. Now, the point I want to make here, what's happened in the last 10 years, I've got several points I want to make about the last 10 years. One point is distrust. After 10 years of a decision being ignored, of constant haranguing about another independence referendum, democratic deficit, de facto referendum, oh no, it wasn't, now we've lost, all of that. And it's clear that it's a never ending. In order to have a vote on such a matter, you actually need both sides to agree to be bound by the vote. The nationalist side, the separatist side, not really nationalist, the separatist side have demonstrated that they won't be bound by any vote, that this will go on and on and on and on. So my first question for you, Alistair, is why would any unionist ever trust them again? Why would any unionist ever engage with a second referendum at any point? Because it would never settle anything. And is it not the case that this short-sighted an approach lacking in any integrity or honour has actually fundamentally undermined their position by building in the majority of the population such a distrust of the very idea of independence that they can never again get it tested? What do you think?
Interesting. It's an interesting thought, that, and you're absolutely correct when you point out the distrust that has come as a result of that, the shock, as it were, that, well, I mean, it began the very next day after we had won. The SNP started talking about another one. And so you know that if there was to be another one, it wouldn't be the last. It would only be the last if the SNP were so beaten by such a huge margin that there was no feasibility of them coming back from that for years and years and years. But if there were to be another one, and the winning margin was less than what it was last time, then of course they're going to say, well, we're making progress, let's have a third one. And until the winning margin became so close that they felt that they were going to win it. So that's been a consequence, certainly, of the referendum period, is the idea. A lot of people have been kind of sickened almost with the idea of referendums. Even the Brexit one did that for some people as well. It's like, oh, I don't like these referendums anymore. And of course, if you continue to lose them, then no wonder. But yeah, it's not been the invigorating process or whatever it was in participatory democracy. That a big word that Hamza likes to throw out there to sound clever, no doubt. But I mean, all democracy is participative in that you actually have to participate in it if you want. So yeah.
Well, I mean, this is where the lack of my point about this is the problem of being led by donkeys, is that whatever you think of Alex Salmond, and I will come back to what I think of Alex Salmond and what he was and is, he was a more able politician than what came after him. Nicola was an indoctrinated follower of Alex Salmond's fashion. She just kept pushing forward in her unrelenting way. And there was no thought, there was no statesmanship, there was no idea of building a nation, there was no idea of listening to anybody. It was Nicola's way or the highway. It was very dictatorial. And this meant that when you couple that with her short-sightedness, then the whole country feels like it's been beaten over the head with basically a pub bore's opinion for 10 years. That's a long time.
Yeah.
Hence the feeling that we need a break.
Exactly. I think that feeling is rising, as it were, and I think that the SNP, so it seems anyway. And as I say, the fortunes of the SNP always depend to an extent upon the fortunes of the government that's running at Westminster, or at least how these fortunes are perceived here in Scotland. But there does seem to be like a fed upness with the SNP, and that's mirrored in the turnout at their events and in their occasional rallies that they might hold. It's all just reduced at the moment. Not saying for a moment that getting Labour in is going to be a whole lot better or anything like that. Every political party has its problems, but I think the SNP at the moment is certainly on the way out for a little while, for a few years. But who knows? But there's always going to be, as you know, there's always this tendency in the Scottish psyche for separation, as it were, from the rest of the UK, as if separation itself will somehow magically transform, the hearts of Scots to all start agreeing with each other on everything.
Yes. So if 10 years of manufacturing distrust wasn't bad enough, the SNP and the pro-independent side, pro-separation side, because remember, they want to be in the EU, so they're not actually talking about independence at all. They're talking about simply being ruled by a parliament even further away, which is less democratic. But in addition to the distrust, we've got now 17 years of misrule by the SNP. Now, Salmond, when he came in, remember 2007, Alex Salmond didn't expect to win. He didn't expect to be in a minority governing administration. And they were really unprepared. But he realized that he needed to create a certain impression. The impression he needed to create was, this is a fresh party with fresh ideas, it's modern, it's going forward, it's optimistic. That was the picture he wanted to paint. Now, he'd no idea how to do that. And therefore, he was led largely by Sir John Elvidge and the Scottish Civil Service, down various means of making us all serfs. But he at least realised he needed to do that. But he started to introduce some very negative things. But of course, when Nicola and then later on Humza and now John Swinney took over, it's simply been ever more negative. It's just been reinforced. So there was a chap called Big Steve was tweeting today. He was quoting John Swinney. John Swinney said, quote, "Unite our country to win independence. That's what we have got to do. And that is what we are going to do." Right? So that was John Swinney on the 1st of this month. So 10 years in, there's no pause to the indie drumbeat. So I responded, I'm sorry that won't fly. After 17 years of misrule, folly, waste, error, corruption and oppression by the totalitarian SNP, one thing is clear. They represent only the road to serfdom. And later on, Jerry Hassan, usual sort of left-wing pseudo-intellectual, supporter of nationalism, had a pop at Murdo Fraser. He said, Murdo loves sticking it to the independents on Twitter, even invoking the logic of a de facto referendum when it suits. But we're on that subject of messes. What about 14 years of the shiftiest UK Tories? So he goes on and attacks the Tories, all the Tories, right? I said, no, Murdo had said that there was 2 referendums and it's time he listened. I responded, Murdo's correct. Furthermore, 17 years of oppression following corruption from the SNP has shown us one thing. They are unfit to govern. This means as long as the SNP remains, India is off the table. So my second point, after 10 years, the SNP has taught us not to trust them. But after 17 years of misrule, what is very clear is that voting to give more power to these same people is voting to enslave ourselves. They've shown themselves to be oppressive, totalitarian, high-handed, very short-sighted, economically incompetent, wasteful, and building a big state and a big power base that simply impoverishes the country. They've shown themselves to have all the statesman-like assuredness of touch of Venezuela. That's what they have shown. They have failed. So my second point is that the misrule of the SNP, the 17 years of failure of the SNP, has so terminally damaged the brand of independence, it can never escape that. As long as the SNP exists, independence is always going to mean, in the minds of many people in Scotland, more of that 17 years of failure, a more intensified version of that 17 years of failure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good point, because we can see what independence, as I alluded to earlier before you came on, we can see what independence would have been like by simply looking at, well, look at what the SNP had done in the last 10 years since 2014. It would be worse, most likely, but it wouldn't be better. I mean, because how would it be better? Where would the better people have come from to run the show? Because the SNP would be the government of the day in an independent Scotland. They liked at the time to tell us, oh, once we're independent, everybody can just vote for whatever parties, and the SNP may or may not get back in. Goodness me.
They would also have written the Constitution.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, they would have written a Constitution and it would have been absolute terrible and full of the sort of thing that you're talking about, and freedom of speech would have gone out the window. Border control would have gone out the window because we would now be a European nation welcoming the world, and the whole thing would have been absolute chaos. And people like ourselves would be struggling at the moment to try to rescue something from the burning embers of what had once been a relatively functioning country, which is which we may still have to do the way things are going generally. But
well, this is it. I mean, the SNP are terrible, but they're only 6 months and 20% worse than certainly the Labour Party, or these days anything that's laughingly called a government. So we have other problems beyond them. But nevertheless, next thing I want to raise, the SNP tweeted today, the contrast over the last 10 years could not be clearer. Now, I'd have to point out, this is quite delusional. They're not seeing the world in a rational, logical manner. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Decisions taken in Scotland are making Scotland fairer. Decisions taken at Westminster are holding Scotland back. Now, notice, just briefly, the words they choose. Decisions made in Scotland, they are not able with a straight face to say, I'm making the lives of the Scottish people better. They can't say that, right? Not even they can say that with a straight face.
Yes.
So to use the code word fairer, right? Fairer means more equally poor communism, basically.
Yes, it's bad circumstances for everybody. That's fair.
Yeah. And decisions taken at Westminster are holding Scotland, by which they mean the SNP, back from achieving the communist state, right? So if you understand what they mean, they're not actually lying. It looks like they're delusional and they're not seeing reality. You've just got to understand what the words mean. And they kind of are describing their reality.
Yes.
So
sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I responded to that and I said to the SNP, you've made of sense. You're trying to place creepy state functionaries over every child and every parent in the land. It was only the UK Supreme Court that ruled your actions illegal that stopped you. Fairer, in your language, means more totalitarian and more oppressed. So the point I want to make here is that the SNP are in favour of the total state. It is communism. And what you have to understand is that they use your vocabulary. They don't use your dictionary. When they say fairer, they don't mean fairer as any little boy or girl aged 2 or 3 would immediately recognize, like, that's mine, you can't take it. No, they mean fairer in the social justice way of thinking, which is, you've got that person over there doesn't, that's not fair. The state will come and forcibly remove your things and redistribute it and keep just, a certain amount for operating expenses. Social justice was the underlying inspiration of the Khmer Rouge. It's why the Khmer Rouge killed 20% of their own population. It was done in the name of social justice. These are dangerous ideas. When they talk about fairer, they don't mean fair as you know the word. They mean fair as in equal outcomes with any amount of aggression and force and folly and poverty and failure and pain involved in the process, because it's fair.
Yes, that's the frightening reality of some of the politicians that we're dealing with. And I think that mentality is especially pronounced. I was having this conversation with somebody earlier certainly in the SNP, but especially in the Green Party. They like to think of themselves as revolutionaries, although I can't imagine them really being able to do very much as far as hands-on revolution is concerned. But intellectually and legislatively, they are very destructive towards those ends that you're talking about. The idea that, well, people are just going to have to suffer we're just going to close down Grangemouth, and thousands of people are going to be suffering economically in that area because, climate change. And we're going to support, medical interventions on little children who are, confused about themselves and things like that. They're very much that vicious mentality that equality has got to be enforced, regardless of consequence, just because that's what they want. That's just for whatever mental reason that they've decided on.
Well, it's the religion. They view it as righteousness. They view it as creating the great utopia that will emerge. Yes. We've just got to destroy everything that prevents it. Everything, including the economy, the middle class, the family, the church, the nation, all of it.
Yes.
So this brings me to Alex Salmond. I said I'd swing back around to Alex Salmond. Right, Alex Salmond. The key to understanding nationalism is you've got to understand that Alex Salmond was a Maoist. He's still got his little Chairman Mao hat. Doesn't wear it often, but he still owns it. He kept that from his student days. Now, the Chinese Communist Party, when it was oppressing the people of China, and they killed, estimates vary, 20 million to 60 million, something like that, maybe more. When it was oppressing the people of China, it divided the people into two categories, the red and the black. The red were the people that the state liked, and the black were the people that the state hated. And they had to be oppressed, shamed, ridiculed, often murdered, but certainly publicly shamed and forced to apologize and beg for forgiveness, right? So, and Alex is a Maoist. So who were the bad guys, right? The black people in communist China. There were initially 5 categories. Landlords. Think what the SNP have done to landlords in this country. Think what they've done to the rental market. They hate landlords. It's exactly the same. Item 2, rich farmers. Go and see what they want to do on land reform. It's all about theft, right? We're not going to have the large estates. We're going to be broken up because fairness. So they hate the rich farmers, what they perceive as the rich farmers. The third category was counter-revolutionaries. Now, to put that into Scottish terms, the word would be unions, right? Unionists, right? Counter-revolutionaries are unions because the revolution is indie, so counter-revolutionary are unions, right? Bad influencers, that would be you, Alistair, and people like you and people like me and people who are willing to speak up. Anyone who's not cowed. Right? And right-wingers, okay? That would be the Tories as they see it. Not that I think the Tories are particularly right-wing, but from the SNP's view as the Tories. So it's essentially identical to Maoism. And they did eventually, the Maoists eventually extended that to include traitors, spy, capitalists, and intellectuals, right? So traitors, well, that'd be unionists again. Spies, if you just have a wee look at how often they mention MI5, and I've been in some of the meetings, and they do, right? Why did they lose in 2014? MI5, it was a plot. Spies. This is openly discussed. I mean, you're laughing. You're laughing because it sounds ridiculous. Well, it is ridiculous. But this is what is discussed in their own meetings. Capitalists, well, that would be successful Scots. They're not wanted. Intellectuals, I'm not sure what the Scottish equivalent of intellectuals is these days because it doesn't exist much in the universities, with a few examples that are maybe on the opposite side. But
that's actually a very good question.
Yeah, maybe the pastors, maybe preachers. I don't know. I also don't know how that translates to Scotland.
People who write for the National probably is how they would describe themselves. Well,
we're a bit light on intellectuals that they would hate. There's plenty of bought and paid for intellectuals, but intellectuals who actually speak out, we're a bit light on those. But it is Maoism. Alex Salmond was a Maoist. It is Maoism. All the unionist pro-British side are the black people, and they view themselves as the red people. And what this is about creating division. You target the people you hate, you isolate them, you put them under pressure, you relentlessly criticize them, you call them names, you shout and spit and swear, and that's how you win. Now, does that sound familiar?
It does sound familiar. I have myself been at the receiving end of crowds of people shouting at me in those ways, with descriptions that I won't even mention on a family show. So yes, there is a certain element who see that as a way to go, and it's somewhat undemocratic to point out the obvious. But it's a consequence of where we are, and it's just an unfortunate fact of living in Scotland, and of course in the rest of the United Kingdom as well. I mean, there's a lot of that mentality. It's particularly pronounced in Scotland because it's a kind of slightly smaller frame to view things through, albeit a very busy one.
So the next thing that brought that was original Maoism, or Maoism in its Scottish form, but they've brought Maoism in its new Western form, which is wokeism. So we've got queer theory being taught to our children. We've got critical race theory. We've got transgender males running rape crisis centres in Scotland. And we've got the one which is just outstanding to illustrate the problem. The Herald, just about a week ago, Police Scotland faced backlash over gender ID policy. So Police Scotland were allowing rapists to self-declare that they were women to foster a strong sense of belonging.
Okay.
So Police Scotland requires no evidence or certification as proof of biological sex or gender identity other than the person's self-declaration, unless it's pertinent to the investigations which are linked with which they're linked as a victim, witness, or accused, and it's evidentially critical that we require this proof, or there is reason for further inquiry based on risk. So I'm not quite sure what all of that means, but basically, Police Scotland, where we're wanting to make those accused of sexual assault feel included, and that seemed to trump, for example, gathering accurate data about where the risks were, protecting women from sexual assault, or such like.
Yeah, it's all upside down.
Yeah, so this didn't go down well, but they've sold out. One of the other things that's been really clear over the last 10 years is the SNP and the Green Party, who are woker than woke, have utterly sold out to the woke version of Marxism. They've bought everything, all the critical race theory, which is hypersensitization based on race, right? I point this out all the time when people say, oh, I'm anti-racist. They use your vocabulary, they don't use your dictionary. What they mean by that is they want to put in policies which differentiate based on race in such a way as to increase equity. So if you're from a quote-unquote advantaged group, you will be discriminated against by law, by policy, to increase equity. And that discrimination, which is based on your skin color, they call anti-racism, right? They are everything they accuse us of being. They are racists. Queer theory is actually largely based on pedophilia and normalizing pedophilia, and is horrendous. And this has been pushed in schools. The education system in schools, we had, in fact, we've got right now in a high school in Aberdeenshire, a book put in there by a transgender gay rights campaigner who's been made headmaster. And the book advocates, amongst other things, bestiality, and that's in the school library. This is what the SNP have done, helped by the Green Party. So wokeism the march of wokeism through our institutions, and the toxic ideology that it is, which is tied in with the whole Maoist thing, but is a little bit distinct. That's another one of the legacies from the last 10 years.
Yes, that's a good point, and I'm glad you brought that one out. That all of those elements, especially in education as well, in Scotland, are just terrible things that are happening, and these cultural elements don't tend to get brought out maybe as much as just the economics of the matter. But it's definitely something to also criticise the SNP and Green partnership upon. And I'm not saying that Labour would be any better, quite frankly. I don't think they've got any desire to deal with those sorts of things. But there's going to have to be a clean out of the stables at one point. We're approaching the top of the hour here, David. I just want to give your Substack a mention. It's called Digging Deeper NE.substack.com, and you're also on x.com/Albion_rover if people need to get you, and we'll put those links into the description box of this YouTube video.
And also on YouTube, Northern Exposure on YouTube, we've just finished a long and detailed study of what we term the John Shields case, which is I think it's a 9-series video, and you might think it's a bit daunting, but it's absolutely gripping stuff. Okay. And it shows exactly what our country has become and exactly what is happening to good men and good women across this country when they fall foul of the state. So I would encourage people to look at the John Shields case as well. Once you start, you'll want to look at it all. It's that sort of series. So I know we're just about out of time. I've saved Humza. I started with Humza. I want to finish with Humza because he's funny.
Yes.
So Humza tweeted today. Apparently wrote something in the National, but I refused to pay for the National. I let you read it and tell us about it.
Yeah, I read it so you'd have to.
So Humza said he's proposed an international solution to break the impasse between Holyrood and Westminster on the constitutional issue. He wants to bring in a foreign third party to help mediate the competing ideologies of the Scottish and UK governments. So I've got 2 questions for you, Alistair. One, what competing ideologies is he talking about? Because I actually don't know, and I suspect neither does he. And secondly, what third party would Humza choose?
Well, the third party that he would choose for something like that would probably maybe be some kind of politically correct statesman from abroad, maybe. But the competing ideologies, well, it's all about fairness and equality and equity, which is the Scottish vision, according to Humza. And the opposite of that, of course, is all the bad things that he can list.
But what would the Labour Party say? Fairness, equality, and equity. Oh, we are right there.
Yes. What? I think it would be very much a mutual congratulations event, really.
Well,
everybody's sitting about patting themselves on the back.
He thinks it's an impasse due to ideological differences, and I don't know what he means, because I mean, you know, Anna Sarwar was giving the same speech as Humza not that long ago. I can't put a cigarette paper between them, really. The only difference is the flag waving you get from the SNP, mostly Palestinian flags these days, to be fair, but there's flag waving.
Yeah.
And that's kind of it.
I think so. And I think we need to, closer to the time, or as soon as we want, really, is highlight this to people as well. Because, I mean, okay, so 2026 rolls around, you don't have John Swinney as First Minister, you have Anas Sarwar. How is that an improvement? other than the fact that presumably we're not going to have another divisive referendum in the period of in a 4-year period. Other than that, there's not really much to be singing to the praises for.
It gives us a break, but remember, Anas Sarwar is Humza Yusuf's speechwriter. That's his job.
Well, it's what do you mean by that?
Well, he gave his first Whitey speech, and Humza copied him.
He did. I wonder, do we actually have that?
They're almost word for word.
We have that. I'll ask our admin, our assistant producer, to fire that one up if we've got it. It's because it's worth seeing again. Let's see if
I don't know how.
No, we don't. We have it elsewhere, but we don't have it here. But yeah.
So I'm sure you're about out of time. Just to kind of finish off, right? The SNP have dug themselves a great hole. They've destroyed trust. They've demonstrated by 17 years of misrule that what they offer is waste, greed, corruption, and serfdom. And they are going down a route which only involves destruction of the country's economy. All of which is the precise reverse of what you need to be doing if you're actually trying to persuade the Scots to change to an independent nation.
Exactly.
So
well summarized.
The longer it goes on, the more desperate they get. What they're looking for is opportunism, right? So there'll be some crisis in Westminster, and we have a ready-built, ready-to-roll solution, which is called Indy, just don't ask any questions. Right, so they're looking for an opportunity. They're looking for opportunism because they want to break up the country. And they don't want to break up the country for any positive reason. They want to break up the country because they want to break up the country. That's it. They hate Britain, and that's their unifying ideology, I'm afraid. Yeah. And if you are, like the majority of Scots, recognise that you're British and actually quite like being British, then they'll hate you too. Unless you beg for forgiveness in some Maoist public forum.
Exactly. Being jeered at.
So the problem that they've got is they've built distrust. They've shown by their failure they can't be trusted to run the country. They can't win on any rational grounds. But neither, because it's a cult and it's a religious cult, neither will it go away. So it's going to sit there. The problem that the unionist side have is lack of opposition. Where is the principled, coherent, sensible, thoughtful, effective opposition? Where is the other way forward? It's not there because the weak spot of unionism is always going to be, well, look at Westminster. And Westminster's been a shit show. Not quite as bad as Holyrood. We're not quite reached the level of third world tin pot dictatorship that the SNP managed. But they're giving it a good go. And they will get there. So that's constantly undermining the British case. The British case cannot be based on Westminster.
I like that. Absolutely. You cannot base it. You cannot base the case for Britain upon the British, upon Westminster. Otherwise, you're simply at the mercy of whoever happens to be in power at that time, who is going to be, just like any other politician, often making very bad decisions and often not making decisions with a wider understanding of our one big country. And that's been a real problem with the British state, to use the nationalists' expression, for many years, really. And it's, as you say, that's our Achilles heel. That's our weakness. David, I think it's been a very good half hour, for 35 minutes now, that we've been speaking. And I do want to thank you for that, folks. David is at x.com/Albion_rover. Digging deeper, ne.substack.com. And also on youtube.com/@Northern Exposure 9510. Check him out for a lot of very interesting, very deep, thoughtful material. David, we must do this again.
Be a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Anytime, Alistair. Thank you very much for having me along.
You're most welcome. All the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Good stuff. David has always got intelligent and perceptive things to say to the matter at hand. So thanks very much, David. Now, folks, give some thanks there for David in the chat. Anthony says thanks, David, as does Charles. Good stuff. Good stuff, folks. Before you go, please do check out this magazine, which is in our shop. It's called 10 Years Strong. Now, this talks about our period, A Force for Good's time between 2012 and 2014, when we were fighting fighting for a no vote. And it also takes us right up to when this was published, which was 2022. Check that out for some historic material on the 2014 referendum. And that's at aforceforgood.uk/shop-1. And you'll get other things there as well, including our wee book and our Tom Gallagher's Scotland Now. And our One Big Country, which you'll get at Amazon. If you go to amazon.co.uk and search for One Big Country, then you will be able to get that. Let's get rid of the shop. There we go. One Big Country. Search Amazon for it. We're going to be working on volume 2 during the month of October and November. We've already got a good name for it as well. All right, folks, thanks for everything. We'll be back next week when we've got an American guest. Looking forward to that. It is, of course, Avelina will be our guest, continuing her theme of Scottish history during the American Rebellion. Until then, folks, it just remains for me to say we did not have a winner tonight of the show, so I'll tell you that before we head off. But otherwise, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next time.